There is no right to a reasoned judgment in a military court, and judgments by military courts often just say guilty or not guilty. There is no independent right of appeal, and a right of appeal also lies within the military justice system to a court of appeal comprised of the Chief of Army Staff or one or more officers designated by him, serving members of the military act as judges. The military is part of the executive, and the executive cannot exercise judicial power over civilians, as this creates a parallel judicial system. Over 80 civilians are still in military custody in relation to the events which occurred on May 9th. In October last year, a 5-member bench of the Supreme Court by majority found that Section 21D of the Pakistan Army Act is unconstitutional. This is the section of the Pakistan Army Act which gave military courts the jurisdiction to try civilians. The court unanimously found that those civilians who are accused of offences in relation to May 9th cannot be tried by military courts and shall be tried by the civilian courts. This was a historic and a landmark decision of the Supreme Court, which was subsequently suspended by a 6-member bench in appeal. The trial of civilians by military courts is an assault on and a violation of fundamental rights. It has now been a year since 9th May, and civilians have been in military custody for several months. There is no right to bail for civilians in the military justice system. The military justice system is governed by opaqueness and secrecy, which is unjustifiable. This is what the majority of the Supreme Court found. This is what has been suspended because of an appeal filed under the Practice and Procedure Law. Justice Muneeb Akhtar, in his detailed judgment declaring military courts unconstitutional, finds that at every instant and at every inch of the territory of Pakistan, fundamental rights must remain, and civilians cannot be placed in a situation where their fundamental rights are actually or potentially suspended. Article 8(5) of the Constitution guards civilians from being placed in a situation where their fundamental rights are suspended, and by subjecting civilians to the Army Act, you are placing them in a situation effectively where fundamental rights could actually or potentially be suspended. Justice Aisha Malik, in her detailed judgment, relies on the fact that military courts do not comply with fair trial and due process standards, which is now enshrined in the Constitution in Article 10A as a fundamental right. There is no right to a reasoned judgment in a military court, and judgments by military courts often just say guilty or not guilty. There is no independent right of appeal, and a right of appeal also lies within the military justice system to a court of appeal comprised of the Chief of Army Staff or one or more officers designated by him, serving members of the military act as judges. The military is part of the executive, and the executive cannot exercise judicial power over civilians, as this creates a parallel judicial system. Military personnel do not qualify as independent and impartial judges, as they are subject to the strict chain of military command. And fundamentally, Article 245 of the Constitution provides that the armed forces are to act in aid of civil power. The armed forces cannot displace civil power, of which the judiciary is an integral part. On this basis, Justice Aisha Malik finds that civilians cannot be subjected to a process which is fundamentally unfair and not in accordance with Article 10A of the Constitution. Justice Aisha Malik also notes in her decision that in 2015, when it came to the trial of suspected terrorists who were waging war against Pakistan, it took a constitutional amendment to try them in military courts. This constitutional amendment had a sunset clause, and it has since lapsed. Presently, citizens are being tried in military courts without a constitutional amendment and by the federal government relying on decades-old precedent, despite the fact that the judicial landscape in Pakistan has changed since then. The trial of civilians by military courts is not a political issue. This is a decision which should have been welcomed, and instead it has been appealed by the Federation, and civilians continue to remain in military custody.